So, welcome to Life, Work and Laundry, Relational Hacks to Living Well. I'm Marianne Chidiac.
I'm Sally Denham-Vaughan. I hope you remember that. Maybe not.
Well, I'll try, Sally. Well, we made a plan, haven't we, today? And we thought we'd talk about, or we concentrate on what we call the Relational Organisational Change, ROG methodology, and the mystery of it, the mystery of relational Gestalt in particular, and why to many it can feel, mysterious in the best possible way, I would say, even sometimes enigmatic.
Yes.
And I found that, when I work with other OD practitioners or coaches that have heard of Gestalt or know something about it, but don't quite get what it is. So I think we're hoping to unpack some of it, some of that mystery today. And we're going to do it in two ways. One, we're going to start by looking at the whole of relational Gestalt and, some of its origin, what it derives from, etc. And then we're going to try to focus on a key component. That's the plan. And as we all know, we never stick to plans, but let's see how far we go. Sounds okay with you?
Yeah, no, it sounds perfect. And I think that bit about the plan, that of course is some of the mystery, in that you have to plan and then you have to surrender the plan to this sort of moment that we call process, emergent
Totally.
process. So
Yeah. So let's start where we said we're going to start. I mean, we know that we've got other ROG videos on our channel. In particular, I mean, there are many different interviews. There's an interview on the book that I did after finishing it, and I'll make sure that that's referenced in the notes for this video as well. But let's go back and assume that people listening to us know nothing about ROG or about Gestalt, and I guess maybe you want to start us off, Sally. What is what's ROG? How can we situate it, and where and what does it derive from, particularly?
Mm. Well, if I start, I mean, we said last time I'm a psychologist by background and you're an engineer. So, both of us in a way like some structure, and I certainly was very cognitive when I started and like to understand processes. And, there were various moments in my training where I thought, actually, something's going on here that's not linear. It's not understandable in terms of the application of a psychological theory. There's something else at play. And I guess I went hunting for that. I was longing for something that could speak to what was going on between people that wasn't logical, rational, and predictable, which certainly in my experience was a lot of what was happening. And one of the things about Gestalt is there is a large psychological component to it, which is, the organization of perception and everything we perceive in an embodied way into a figure of interest in a background. And the Gestalt psychologists really gave us very good maps about that, which we'll come on to talk about, and how they come into the application of Gestalt. But I think what people perhaps don't realize initially is that it is primarily an applied philosophy.
Yes.
And it's philosophical in the sense of having at its heart the felt sense. There's a saying, the whole is different to the sum of its parts. And I think the mystery comes from different in what way. I'm thinking of times in my life when I've been involved in looking at consciousness. How does consciousness emerge? And it's mysterious and awesome and makes us what we are. And I think Gestalt in many ways is trying to get into that moment of what emerges as figure in a group of people that then drives action. But the emergent moment is mysterious, awesome, potent. If we think about love, who we love, courage, what we would die for, what we would fight for, those things are often not logical or linear. They are mysterious and potent.
Mhm.
Um,
In a way, listening to you talk, I guess what's at the heart of it really is experience.
yes,
You know, and fundamentally, we can't predict experience. We can't kind of know where it's going. We just live it, and
yes,
that's why it's staying close to that that
yes,
actually provides that sort of air of mystery, because people expect to know and almost to predict what's coming next,
yes,
especially in organizations. Yeah.
yes, yes.
I like, and it's maybe my, I'm kind of a bit engineering a bit, is to sort of say where is it derived from, because you did refer back to what I feel is almost like three phases
Mm,
in the evolution almost of Gestalt and relational Gestalt, you know. And
mm,
so you mentioned Gestalt psychology,
mm,
you know,
mm,
and some people might not know that, you know, Gestalt itself is a bit of a weird word because it's a German word that
mm,
hasn't got a very, you know, clear translation like many words
mm.
in English. And I think the closest it gets to, I think it's organized whole.
Oh, with a
Yes,
W.
W with a W rather than an H. Oh, yeah. So WH.
Yeah.
And it comes from Gestalt psychology, of course,
Mm,
and they try to show that human beings perceive things in wholes, WHO,
yes.
and not in parts. So
Yeah.
we can't disconnect things. It's a whole experience that has to
Yes.
be held.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's so vital because that, I mean, obviously, we do predict, we do look back, and we
Mm,
do deconstruct our experience into questioning why did we do that and what was the rationale, and
mm,
you know the analytic method, which was
mm,
so primary in
mm,
psychology. Um, but in that moment of experience, what emerges next is often unpredictable and informed in an implicit way, an
mm,
embodied way,
mm.
rather than a planned, organized, linear,
Totally,
task-focused way. And when
totally.
we organize ourselves solely on the planned, linear, task-focused way, we miss so much of what's most potent in human experience. So,
Yeah, absolutely.
mm,
And you know, just sort of continuing on that. So I was saying, you know, three phases. The first one is Gestalt psychology, and then you sort of say, okay, so this is experience, and what do we do with it? And I think this is where Fritz Perls and his wife Flora Perls, Paul Goodman, Ralph Hefferline, you know, the kind of the original authors of Gestalt therapy theory, you know, in that time brought about, as you said, an informed and applied philosophy, because they looked at a variety of philosophies to see how to deal with and stay close to this experience,
mm,
how to manage it. So they looked at existentialism, they looked at phenomenology, the work of Martin Buber. Maybe we'll come back to that, talking about dialogue, and also a lot of Eastern philosophies that really
then,
gives, yeah,
yeah,
so
yeah,
Zen, exactly, Buddhism, exactly, that give Gestalt its focus on the present moment, you know, what we call in Gestalt the here and now.
yeah.
And it's and I think it's a real strength to have that, because it's not that, okay, it's difficult, it's complex, it's mysterious, but I think what we also have is how can we be with it. Yeah.
Mm, yes.
um, and for me, the third phase, you know, very quickly, because I'm sure we'll talk about it again, is when I think the originally perhaps primarily individualistic focus of Gestalt sort of shifted in
Mm,
what we would call a more relational turn. And I would say that's the later phase of development, which
yes.
is what we respond to in ROG. And you know, recognizing it's a dialogic and relational approach. Um,
That was a huge turn, really. That, you know, when Lynn Jacobs brought in dialogue in that particular way she did,
mm,
I guess we were starting then to think about not what is your primary individual need, which Gestalt had been very focused on classically, but what is the impact in the wider field of you meeting your need?
yeah,
So that tension then between, you know, what I need and what the consequences of meeting my need might be
yes,
that accrue to me when I'm aware. You know,
mm,
if I do an act that is damaging or harmful or resource stripping, then in some ways the belief in the dialogic relational turn is that affects the whole field and myself, as well as the other who's directly impacted.
Yes.
Because that relational turn in organizational life is
Mm.
very different to the individualistic, what do we need,
Mm.
which I guess is to win and be the most successful.
Absolutely.
Um,
Yeah.
mm,
God, in
mm,
organizations and many other places. Good. So I think we've done a good bit on that first part, on the whole. Shall we get into some of the components?
yes, yeah. I
Okay.
mean, I'm just going to, if it's okay, just put in one of my heroes who I think was highly influential,
Yeah.
which was Carlos Castaneda.
Mm.
And, the sort of South American indigenous shamanic idea of journeying, which is so close to phenomenological tracking,
Mm.
and how that came in really as the early teachings being informed as. So there was this otherness, this mystery, this sort of sense of, I'll use a more interconnected way of being in the world that was seeded in Gestalt at the beginning.
Mm.
But the primary focus, I guess, of that early team, although Goodman was a community psychologist and educator, was the individual change process.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Mm,
I think I like the fact that you get some more indigenous kind of cultures and philosophies, because we
yeah,
often forget
yeah,
we believe in Western cultures that everything has started here. And of
yeah,
course, tracking the experience of others and staying close and journeying alongside
mm.
is much more ancient than that.
Yes,
Good.
yes, yes.
Right.
Mm,
So
exciting.
it is exciting. I
Mm,
thought that perhaps a good starting point for one of the components, or core components part, at least for me, for ROG, is the fact that it's an emergent approach.
mm, mm,
Um, Maybe I want to say something about what emergence means. It's a concept that is in philosophy, but also in systems theory, which means that any complex entity has properties or behaviors that
mm,
exceed, that are more than the sum of its individual parts, and that these properties emerge when they interact
mm,
in the wider whole.
mm,
And I think that fits because for me in ROG, in our view of organizations, they are living systems.
mm,
They self-organize, they respond to their environment. So of course they are emergent.
mm,
And that stands in opposition to a view, of course, as we've maybe mentioned before, of organizations that operate like machines, with leaders like captains of a ship, pulling levers, etc.
mm,
And the reality is that a lot of organization, despite the age of artificial intelligence, where we think everything is run by machines, is still very much about people. And
mm,
even organizations, for me, that have very slick processes,
mm,
managing people through any change process is about tackling uncertainty
mm,
and sitting with emergence and accepting emergence.
mm, mm, mm. Yeah, it's such an interesting phenomenon. If we go back to that mystery, I compared it to the mystery of consciousness.
Mm,
Where does it come from? How does it arrive?
mm,
And I guess when we go into an organization for consulting, change processes, whatever, there are some assumptions that the organization is not changing,
mm,
is not a living system,
absolutely.
is a static, dead world in a way of hierarchy and function until a change process is initiated.
Yes.
Whereas I think, in ROG, we take the view very much that an organization is constantly adapting as best it can to
Mm,
its context.
mm,
And that is the ecological methodology that we propose
mm,
and that we really major on. So
mm,
that emergent phenomena of saying, what are the principles by which this system is naturally self-organizing and
mm,
responding?
mm,
Um, is a part of Gestalt theory.
mm,
It's also part of the ROG methodology.
mm. And
to live
yeah,
that. Yeah,
it's unique about ROG as well,
it
isn't
is.
it? It's quite unique about ROG.
Yeah,
As you say, it gives the hint of mystery.
yeah.
Because a lot of, I mean, I love when you say, you refer to back to other OD approaches. Of course, at the heart of OD is Kurt Lewin's work, but some
Yes.
of his early work was very much about freeze and unfreeze,
Oh,
you know,
absolutely.
and that's this kind of this sequential, as if things can stay in a status quo and not shift.
Yeah.
And it doesn't really speak to the experiential and process-driven approach that Gestalt sort of
Mm,
holds
mm,
dear. And because, you know, it means that when you work with an organization, um, everything that happens in the room emerges in that moment. You know, when you're with a client, when when you're tracking the dynamics of the team you're coaching at the moment, you know, you can't assume that it's going to be fixed in a certain way, and therefore the way you are with that team can't be pre-planned or predicted, and that
mm.
in a sense can feel very mysterious. You know, it's like,
Yes.
I don't know where it's going.
Yeah. It is interesting because I'm also thinking that you and I spend hours and hours pre-planning and making predictions
Yeah.
in the knowledge that that preparation will prepare us in many ways to be present and to be open to what is the actuality of the emerging moment. You know, I'm thinking when Pearl Cephaline and Goodman wrote that wonderful chapter called Feeling the Actual.
Sure.
You know, it's not telling the story of what happened previously, although that is relevant in the now, and neither is it running towards the vision of what we think we want to be. It is being here in this exact moment and seeing what our embodied experience informs us about of how best to be in relation to that particular event site. And I think that is some of the skill of the ROG methodology, that, as you say, that embodied unique awareness of the moment to moment process, teaching that, delivering that, that I would say is very unique to this approach.
And I think that's obviously what attracted me, and that's why I stuck with Gestalt. I come very much from a consulting background where, we had reams and reams of methodology and how
Yes.
things were done. But what ROG gives really, or tells us, is that uncertainty and emergence are givens in organizations and in people, because they're such complex entities.
Yeah.
And now, how can we operate well in these given parameters is the challenge. And rather than what a lot of approaches do is oversimplify.
Reduce, isn't it?
Yes,
Reduce
reduce,
complexity.
oversimplify, that abstraction.
Yeah.
And how can we, rather than the ROG approach focuses on how can up the skill, as you said, of individuals, and not reduce the complexity. And not reduce and oversimplify things.
Yeah.
And I think that's exactly why ROG is so powerful in the moment. It
Yes.
offers individuals and teams and organizations a frame in which they can understand and cope with the complexity that emergence gives them, and supports themselves as well.
Yeah. I'm thinking of a tutorial I did recently where, we were talking about the 3 curriculum in ROG of, vertical development of self, this use of self as instrument that's huge in relation to others in those contextual conditions. And those developmental lenses, I think my experience of organizations were, none of those were really taught as being relevant.
Yes.
I learned a lot of other skills about project management and execution of projects, and but nothing about how to be with what was actually going on. It's a little bit like some forms of psychotherapy where you make the assessment and then implement the protocol.
Yes.
And whatever happens, you stick with what you decided back then was relevant.
Yeah.
And I think it's very interesting how, I can fully understand and appreciate the desire of organizations to fix themselves as much as possible in order to apply a change methodology and then evaluate the outcome.
Yeah.
As if something's constantly moving, shifting, and changing,
Yeah.
it becomes much more difficult to predict and evaluate outcomes. And then how do you know
Mhm.
what's
Mhm.
been successful?
Mhm. Yeah, and you could see that emergence will probably give the fear in
Yes,
most managers, put the fear of death in most
yes,
managers,
yes,
because
yes,
it's like, how can we control this
yes,
illusion that you need to be in control
yes,
at every
yes,
moment is
yes.
um,
Well, and I think
it
the
is an illusion.
research, it is an illusion. The research clearly tells us this. We've got
Mm,
about 80% failure rate of OD
mm,
interventions and project management.
mm,
And yet we carry on
mm,
the idea that that in and of itself will be successful.
mm,
And I'm not denying the need for some vision, purpose, plan,
mm,
evaluation. But I
mm,
think the ability to be with the emerging moment and pivot into that
mm.
is a key ROG skill.
Absolutely, yeah, great. I think we could keep talking about this for hours. So
I've
point,
no doubt.
next point, next component part. I said we said we could talk about impact and intention, the fact that
Mm.
we are part of a relational field. Do you want to kick us off on that?
Well, I'm aware of time and thinking any or all of these might be good topics for follow-up. But
Mm,
the original Gestalt formulation was get in touch with my embodied need, my
mm,
sensation function.
mm,
And that attracted me. I was working with body process, eating distress, psychosexual dysfunction, and applying a cognitive methodology to an embodied process does
mm,
leave you feeling, we're not quite hitting the spot. So I got interested in Gestalt because of the embodied attention to
mm,
what emerges in that lens.
mm,
Um, and classic Gestalt says track that need into awareness, mobilize it by focusing on it, and then act as if the field is a resource to meet your need.
mm, mm.
Which is a good description of some forms of Western capitalism,
Yes,
I,
totally.
I think.
Mm,
And I know Frank Stamler in his writing, really uses this word predation, that we
mm,
end up really being hyper vigilant of the field as a resource. And the relational turn is to say, let's, as we are acting to meet our need, be very aware of the consequence of meeting our need.
mm,
And I think, I suppose some of my passion for the relational turn is in thinking, surely we can't go on viewing the world and other people as resources for growth.
mm,
At what
mm,
point do we think that's
mm,
simply not sustainable and it's unethical to boot?
mm, mm,
These are
mm,
interconnected, interdependent beings.
mm,
Um, and that's where the impact lens of the relational turn is felt.
mm.
Um,
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I'd almost also go back one step just to talk about impact and intention. Intention, the intent refers to often what, as individuals, we intend in something and what we have in mind. For example, in a work context, a person who intends to give some constructive feedback, let's say, I'm giving you, I love your shirt, Sally, but I'm not sure what the impact of that is going to be. So
yeah.
impact is how the behavior or how the intervention or whatever it is received by
Mm,
the other person. Did
yeah.
they hear it as constructive, helpful? Did they hear it as a criticism? Now, in many paradigms, the only thing that would matter was person A's intention in
Yes.
giving this.
Mm.
And the view would be that, if person B didn't quite get it, well, tough, actually. Now,
Yes.
yeah, and it was purely their issue and or responsibility if they felt criticized. Whilst in a relational Gestalt frame, we really hold that um, that each person has responsibility for an exchange and how it unfolded. Sometimes it's not 50-50 responsibility,
Oh,
particularly if there's a power differential, I think, between the two people. But
mm,
generally, in terms of Gestalt theory, it holds that we're part of a relational field and we always have to take responsibility for how things co-emerge between us.
yeah.
I mean, people even that don't work in organizations can see how this could play out in couples,
Yes.
but certainly in organization, how quickly when someone underperforms, for example, there's a tendency to blame them, to say, it's all about them, rather than the level of support they've had, the way they're viewed or perceived or even interacted with. So that delicate balance between what I intend, how that's received, how much responsibility is mine, and other is there's such intricate issues that need, I think, careful attention.
Yeah, and very skillful attention in some way, because you raise this very tricky ethical issue
Mm,
of my experience is, in a way, my truth.
mm,
The danger is that in a field of power, that my truth becomes the truth, and I
yes.
can assert that.
Mm,
I have a bit of a problem with sense of humor. So I've often been told to lighten up, it was just a joke, and you're oversensitive. And I think, that really is the dialogic space that we move towards in
mm,
ROG, of thinking, as you say, it's mutual, it's not equal.
mm,
Is it my lack of humor?
mm,
And or is the joke conveying some message that in a, as a micro behavioral sign, I've felt and picked up and has made me uneasy and uncomfortable, that we then need to dialogue about.
yes, absolutely.
So that I think is, as you say, in couples, in small systems, intimate systems, but in organizations,
Mm,
it's the root of a lot of conflict.
yeah, totally. Well, it's fortuitous you were mentioning dialogue. I think that probably would be another big component part.
Absolutely.
So I think, yeah, the concept of dialogue in organizations, and I'm starting in organizations, is not new, is it? I think people
Yeah.
um, would have heard of the work of Bill Isaacs and David Bohm. Certainly coaches and OD practitioners would have. And in Gestalt theory and in ROG, dialogue occupies such a very central place, as you've
Mm,
just said.
mm, mm.
So, and I think that's because we start from the assumption, as we were just saying, that we each have a unique and very different experience. And the only way that we're going to know and get even close to the experience of someone else or experience of the team is through the practice of dialogue.
Yes.
Yeah.
And dialogue being a million miles beyond conversational skills, or
Oh yes.
and how to present a message with impact and influence, or we talking here with dialogue as an ethical attitudinal stance to otherness.
Yeah.
Am I curious about the other? Am I willing to be influenced by the other?
Mm, mm,
And those two components, I guess,
mm,
being critical to this dialogical space.
mm,
If I'm not willing to be influenced,
mm,
then I may as well just download my message,
mm,
and in a way I'm in a compliance situation rather
mm.
than a dialogic situation.
Yes.
And they are very, very different.
Yeah. I, as hear you unpack, of course, and it'll take a lot more than the time we have, but just to unpack the notion of dialogue here, it's worth really mentioning that in ROG and in Gestalt, dialogue is based on the work of Martin Buber. And
Yes.
in ROG, we've also said it's Martin Buber and also somehow the work of Bakhtin, Mikhail Bakhtin, actually comes into play there, and I think it's I love when you kind of differentiate now, and that's what Buber did. He differentiates between two ways of being, different modes of being with others: the I it and what they call the I thou place,
Mm.
and I think what you're talking about here, or giving a great example of, is how the I thou is a different way of relating to another,
Mm. Mm.
And he says, I love that sentence. He always, I remember it. He says, you relate to other as an experiencing subject, not an experienced object. Isn't that
Yeah.
powerful? Isn't that amazing?
It's wonderful. And
Yes.
and I think to read Buber, you do
Mm,
get a sense of back to the mystery, the
mm,
awe and the wonder,
mm,
and I'm thinking, some of his most, to me, beautiful writing is around the relationship to a tree, with
yes.
a tree, to a tree, with a tree.
Yeah.
And the idea that the tree is communicating back, is in
Mm,
dialogue with us.
mm,
And what it brings, what it gives, how it influences us,
mm,
become
mm,
aware of, and
mm,
have a completely different sense then of being with alongside the tree
mm,
rather than it's a tree.
mm, mm,
You
mm,
know, it becomes part of the living world, I guess, part of the complex living system that's
mm,
emerging
mm,
and part of the ecology.
mm.
So,
And it's also fair to recognize that we can't always do that. So, I mean, I'll just give an example, going away reluctantly though from the tree, it's almost saying, how often do we relate to others, or even to someone that we probably feel we don't have a main relationship in an organization, like someone's PA, let's say,
yeah, yes,
very much in an objectified way. It's just as someone that's booking the meeting, and they just seeing the role there rather than the person. And we often do it because we're in a rush. I
yes,
don't think there's a judgment in it. We sometimes have to do it. We're
mm,
being tactical in terms of where we put our energies, etc. But it isn't really the best way to influence someone or to manage a relationship or just to be with someone. And it doesn't invite trust and mutuality. So,
no,
yeah. So there's a
absolutely.
balance to be struck, isn't it, in an
Yes,
organization, in a rushed context, between what's the right amount of dialogic versus tactical, if I can call
yes,
it that way, relating.
yes. And I guess, that's been a constant unfolding theme in our writing,
Mm,
is that do we exert our will, our intention upon the environment,
mm,
or do we spend more time in dialogue with the environment, or
mm,
do we allow the environment to inform and influence us?
yes.
Where are we on that sort of we call it a dialectical tension, because we don't
Mm,
want to polarize. We don't want to get
mm,
into I must always tell people what to do and they must always comply, or I must always listen to the other and respond in
mm,
their favor. It is a moving complex
mm. And
emerging.
polarizing, yeah, polarizing in either is really bad. Is
It's
really
unhelpful.
it's unhelpful.
Yeah,
Is
yeah,
Well, I was going to say a word stronger than unhelpful, and I guess I go there when I see what's going on in the world today. I think this it seems like dialogue is lost.
yeah,
We sit
yeah,
with more conflict, more violence,
yes,
and it feels like there's total objectification, or
yeah.
there's total objectification of the other. But
Well,
anyway.
yes, well, no, it's important, and it's
Mm,
important to this methodology because
mm,
objectification of the other into a
mm,
thing
mm,
is necessary. What part of what philosophy tells us, phenomenological philosophy, is it's necessary if we want to coerce the other into complying with our will when it is at odds with their will and or best interests.
mm, mm,
So that's when we have to desensitize ourselves in a
mm,
range of ways to
mm,
enforce compliance.
mm,
And again, it's a very interesting part of the ROG methodology to look at
mm,
governance
mm,
processes,
mm,
compliance codes, standard
mm.
operating processes, you know, to see what degrees of freedom do people have to
Mm,
act,
mm, mm,
at what level in the organization. So this is, I guess, getting into the micro methodology of ROG,
mm, mm,
but these are the core skills and these are the principles that
mm,
inform.
mm. And that need to keep in balance, how much, because what I'm hearing you say is that there's a need for order, there is a need for structure. And when you do that, then there is some level of objectification. But at what point does this order, um, go so far as to become unethical? And
Yes.
okay, there's so much written about that as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. And I think we notice that increasingly, I hope well, I have my doubts, but I hope well, at an explicit level. We're
Mm,
quicker maybe to think certain forms of bullying, harassment are unacceptable. But I'm not sure we notice the early relational signs of
mm,
objectification. Um,
mm,
and because one of the things that dialogue does when we talk about being influenced is it opens us to a richly diverse field.
mm,
We're welcoming difference because we want to hear different experiences in order to maximize the health of the whole. And so that's where we get, I guess, to that third lens of field theory, where a richly diverse field in dialogue is an optimally healthy organization. However, it can't be an organization without structure and process and hierarchy and role and function.
Yes.
It would just be a lot of different people hanging out together having a time, you know. So
and you know, that's that sort of reminds me, in fact, you've taken us to the Bakhtin view of dialogue, isn't it? Because he talks about, you know, multiple voices. He calls it
multiple.
polyphony, isn't it?
Yes.
And that and I think it's very rich, but actually we must dialogue in order to have a construction polyphony, or constructive, I think he says constructive cacophony. So,
Yeah.
you know, in a way that there needs to be enough dialogue for the multiplicity of voices to come in. Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely.
And and that, you know, where we find those balancing points, that is very complex in itself, isn't it? That is often an aesthetic judgment. You know, it's a judgment based on ethics. It's a judgment based on, do I want people engaged or complying? Am I viewing people as resources, or, you know,
Totally.
engaged stakeholders? What do I want from this group of people?
Yeah.
The outcome is hugely different.
Yeah, very much so. Okay, in awareness of time, I feel there's one more that we can't not mention, even if quick mention, which is, I think, which is really often spoken with the Gestalt approach, which is the use of self.
Yes, yes.
And I think I came across it initially through Edwin Nevis's work. You know, Edwin Nevis being one of the first people who wrote about Gestalt in organizations, and he defined the use of self, you know, in terms of the way in which our observations, our values, our feelings are taken into account when we're trying to, you know, intervene with another. In other words, making ourselves almost an instrument of change, and allowing sensation and feeling, as well as thinking, as well as cognition, inform our interventions. And I think that is often, of course, what we do, but not in awareness. So Gestalt invites us to use these sources of data more deliberately. Yeah.
Much more. Yes. Yeah. I often think, you know, that curriculum of use of self, relationship with other, and awareness of the field, you know, it's core to the development of a ROG practitioner. And it really does start with use of self as instrument, and becoming increasingly aware of embodied sort of sensate functions and how that is energizing or not action.
Yes.
And I think it's a tough ask, and it's a tough ask of leaders, but it is one that is increasingly being seen as necessary, I think, is that people are open to the experience of being constantly present at the contact boundary.
Yes. And aware, you know, and I think we're not going to open the whole topic of presence, but presence is the way in which we make that use of self possible, and deal with the complexity and the emergence. Oh, wow. It feels like we've gone at speed through through a hell of a lot.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm aware of what we've named and what we haven't named, and you know, some of the key topics. But yeah, I guess that process cycle of Gestalt, where we use ourselves in the contact sequence and cycle, you know, it's a topic in and of itself. But I feel we've had a good sort of what are the components of the mystery?
Absolutely.
Naming.
I think it's probably enough for now.
I agree.
Yes.
I agree.
Good to talk to you as always.
Yeah, and you, Mac.
Bye.
Bye.